December 29, 1876. Somewhere in the howling darkness above the Ashtabula River in Ohio, a locomotive engineer named Daniel McGuire feels something wrong beneath his wheels. The bridge is dropping, slowly at first, then faster, and the 11 cars behind him are pulling downward like an anchor, dragging him into the frozen ravine 70 feet below. McGuire's engine lurches forward just as the coupling snaps, and his locomotive claws its way onto solid ground, while everything else behind him disappears into the ice and the fire that follows. That night, 92 people would never see morning, and the firefighters who arrived at the scene refused to put out the flames. The fire chief, a man named Knapp, stood there while survivors screamed from inside burning wreckage and told bystanders there was no point in trying. Bodies burned so completely that 48 of them could never be identified, reduced to what newspapers called shapeless lumps of charred flesh. 2 weeks later, Charles Collins, the bridge's chief engineer, took his own life. 5 years after that, Amasa Stone, the man who designed the thing, did the same. This is the story of railroad bridges that gave way. And if you think Ashtabula was bad, it does not even crack the top 5. Let's start with what happened in New Zealand on Christmas Eve, 1953. A passenger train carrying 285 people was rolling through the night toward Auckland when the driver spotted something impossible ahead. The Wangehu River, normally calm, had become a roaring wall of mud and boulders tearing through the darkness. Hours earlier, a volcanic dam on Mount Ruapehu had collapsed without warning, sending 340,000 cubic meters of acidic water screaming down the valley at tremendous speed. That lahar had already knocked out the bridge piers by the time the train arrived. The driver hit the brakes, but momentum carried the locomotive and 6 carriages straight into the torrent. 151 passengers went into the water that night. 20 bodies were never recovered, washed out to sea. The name of the place, Tangiwai, means weeping waters in Maori, and every Christmas Eve since, a wreath gets thrown from a passing train as it crosses the replacement bridge. Now, here's the thing about bridge failures. Sometimes it's the engineering, sometimes it's the weather, and sometimes it's just pure human stupidity combined with bad timing. Take what happened near Mobile, Alabama in September 1993. A towboat pilot named Willie Odom was pushing 6 coal barges through dense fog on the Mobile River when he made a wrong turn into a channel that was closed to commercial traffic. Odom had never been properly trained on his radar equipment, had no compass, no nautical chart, and couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him. At 2:45 in the morning, his barges slammed into a railroad bridge and knocked the tracks 3 feet out of alignment. 8 minutes later, the Amtrak Sunset Limited came through at 70 miles per hour. The engineer had no warning because the rails had not actually broken, so the signal stayed green. 3 locomotives and 4 passenger cars plunged into the bayou, fuel tanks ruptured on impact, and 47 people lost their lives in what remains the worst accident in Amtrak history. The train had been delayed 30 minutes in New Orleans because someone needed to fix a toilet. If they had left on time, they would have crossed that bridge 20 minutes before the barge ever hit it. December 28, 1879, Scotland. The Tay Bridge was the longest iron bridge in the world at the time, stretching nearly 2 miles across the Firth of Tay. Designer Thomas Bouch had been knighted just months earlier after Queen Victoria herself crossed it in the royal train. That evening, a gale was howling, somewhere between force 10 and force 11, with winds gusting up to 80 miles per hour, blowing directly perpendicular to the bridge structure. Painters who had worked on the bridge earlier that year reported that it shook violently whenever trains crossed, sometimes swaying 2 or 3 inches side to side. Nobody did anything about it. When the 520 passenger train from Edinburgh entered the high girder section, the entire center span gave way and dropped 75 people into the freezing water below. Every single person aboard perished. The inquiry that followed discovered something remarkable about the design. Bouch had made no allowance whatsoever for wind loading. He simply had not calculated for it. 10 months after the disaster, Bouch was gone too, a broken man whose reputation had been completely destroyed. And then there is Switzerland, June 14, 1891. A bridge over the river Birs was designed by Gustave Eiffel, the same man who had built the famous tower in Paris just 2 years earlier. The train that day was packed with over 500 passengers. As the locomotive reached the far side, the center of the bridge appeared to simply buckle. 2 engines and multiple carriages plunged into the flooded river below. 73 people lost their lives in what remains Switzerland's worst rail disaster ever. The investigation that followed led engineers to realize that Euler's formula for calculating buckling stress and compression members was fundamentally flawed and needed correction. An Eiffel bridge collapsing while the Eiffel Tower stood perfectly fine must have been quite the irony for anyone paying attention. Flash floods account for some of the most sudden and devastating failures in this list. On August 7, 1904, near Eden, Colorado, the number 11 Missouri Pacific Flyer was crossing a wooden trestle over a normally dry creek bed when a wall of water came out of nowhere. The engineer had been warned about thunderstorms and had slowed down to watch for washouts, but the flood wave struck just as the locomotive cleared the bridge. The force threw the cars sideways, snapped the coupling to the rear Pullman sleepers, and dragged 97 people to their doom. Bodies turned up as far as 22 miles downstream. The bloodhounds sent to search had to be recalled because of quicksand. Remains of a woman, described as handsomely dressed and about 25 years old, were found 2 days later, carried that far by the current. 24 hours after the wreck, the bridge had already been rebuilt and trains were running again. India has seen its share of these tragedies too. In October 2005, a train packed with families heading home for Diwali celebrations passed over a small bridge near Valagonda when an irrigation tank upstream ruptured without warning. The flash flood swept the bridge away in darkness, and nobody reported the damage before the Delta fast passenger train arrived. 114 people went into the water that night. In 1988, the Island Express crossing a bridge over Ashtabula Lake in Kerala somehow derailed and sent 10 of its 13 coaches plunging into the water below. 105 passengers lost their lives, and to this day, no one knows exactly what caused it. The official explanation blamed a tornado, but local fishermen who were there insist no such thing ever happened. The first major bridge disaster in American history came on November 1, 1855 in Missouri. The Pacific Railroad was celebrating its inaugural run to Jefferson City with 600 very important people aboard when the train reached an unfinished bridge over the Gasconade River. The chief engineer, Thomas O'Sullivan, had declared the bridge safe after a test run the previous day, but heavy rain had been falling, and they skipped the mandatory inspection because they were running behind schedule. The span collapsed as soon as the locomotive entered it, and the engine tipped backward onto the first passenger car, which was carrying most of the dignitaries. O'Sullivan himself was among the 43 who never made it home. His bridge took him with it. And finally, the oldest entry on this list, May 6, 1853, Norwalk, Connecticut. A swing bridge over Norwalk Harbor was open to let a steamship pass, and the signal ball had been lowered to warn approaching trains. The engineer of the Boston Express, a substitute driver on only his third trip along the route, somehow missed the signal entirely and came around the curve at 50 miles per hour. By the time he realized the bridge was open, he was only 400 feet away. The locomotive flew across the 60-foot gap and slammed into the opposite abutment 8 feet below track level before sinking into 12 feet of water. 48 people perished, many of them doctors returning from a medical convention in New York City. 10 bridges, 10 moments where steel and iron and wood gave way beneath the weight of human ambition. Some of these failures led to new engineering standards, some led to new safety regulations, and some just left behind monuments and memorial plaques that most people walk past without ever knowing what happened there. The stumps of the original Tay Bridge piers are still visible above the water at high tide, standing there like tombstones for the 75 souls who went down with them.